The email came with a subject line that made my hands shake. From Chaplain Morrison. About Baghdad 2004, I need to confess. Captain James Morrison, our battalion chaplain in Iraq. The man who'd been with us through the worst months of the insurgency, who'd prayed over our wounded, who'd counseled us through trauma and loss, who'd given memorial services for our dead, and who'd disappeared in August 2004 without explanation. One day he was there, the next day gone, replaced by a new chaplain. No announcement, no goodbye, no explanation, just gone. For 20 years I'd wondered what happened. Why a chaplain who'd seemed dedicated to our battalion would abandon us mid-deployment during our darkest period. Now, 2 decades later, he was reaching out, asking to meet, promising to explain why he'd left. The email gave an address, a small church in rural Pennsylvania. Come Tuesday night 11 p.m., after evening service ends, the church will be empty. I need to tell you what happened, what I saw, why I couldn't stay. Please, I've carried this for 20 years, and I'm drowning in it. James Morrison. I drove 6 hours to that church, arriving at 10:45 p.m. Found Morrison sitting in the front pew, looking older and more broken than I'd imagined. The confident chaplain I remembered had been replaced by someone who looked spiritually shattered. "Sergeant Walker," he said without turning around. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Wasn't sure I deserved for you to. You left us, chaplain. Middle of deployment. No explanation. Just gone. So yeah, I'm here, because I want to know why." Morrison finally turned to face me. His eyes were haunted, hollow. "I left because I witnessed something that destroyed my faith. Something I was ordered not to report. Something that made me realize I couldn't serve both God and the military anymore. And I've spent 20 years trying to rebuild a faith that was shattered in one terrible day." "What did you witness?" Morrison stood and walked to the altar as if drawing strength from the sacred space. "July 28, 2004. Do you remember that day?" "I did. A day like many others during that brutal summer. Patrols, checkpoints, tension, sporadic contact with insurgents. Nothing that stood out as extraordinary. We had normal operations. Nothing unusual that I recall. That's because what I witnessed didn't involve your platoon. It involved Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon. They were operating in a different sector, and I was with them that day, providing chaplain support during a clearing operation." Morrison pulled out a worn journal from his jacket. "This is my chaplain's journal from Iraq. I kept daily notes, who I counseled, what services I held, what I observed, standard practice for military chaplains. And this entry from July 28th is the reason I left Iraq, the reason I've spent 20 years in spiritual crisis." He opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. 2nd Platoon was clearing a suspected insurgent safehouse. Standard operation, knock and announce, search the premises, detain military-age males for questioning. I was there to provide moral support, to be a calming presence, to remind our soldiers of their ethical obligations. The house had a family, husband, wife, 3 children, ages maybe 4, 7, and 9. The husband was military age, so he was zip-tied and prepared for transport. The wife was hysterical, the children were crying. Chaotic, but normal for these operations. Morrison's voice started shaking. Then the squad leader, Staff Sergeant Briggs, found something, hidden under a floorboard in the back room. A weapons cache. Not small, 6 AK-47s, ammunition, 2 RPG launchers, improvised explosive devices, significant weapons that confirmed the house was definitely being used by insurgents. Briggs radioed it in. Battalion Command congratulated him on the find, told him to secure the weapons, detain the husband, and continue the operation. Standard procedure. But then something happened. Something that wasn't in any official report. I felt my chest tighten. What happened? After Briggs reported the find, the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, came on the radio with new orders. Orders that weren't standard procedure. Orders that I knew were illegal. Morrison sat down heavily in the front pew. Hayes ordered Briggs to neutralize the insurgent cell. Those were his exact words. Neutralize the insurgent cell. And when Briggs asked for clarification, Hayes said, "The weapons cache confirms hostile activity. All occupants of the residence are to be considered enemy combatants. Neutralize the threat." My blood ran cold. He ordered them to kill the family. He ordered them to kill everyone in that house. The husband, the wife, the 3 children, all of them. Because weapons were found in the house, Hayes classified everyone as enemy combatants and ordered their execution. And Briggs followed that order. He gathered his squad in the front room, explained what Hayes had ordered. He gathered his squad in the front room, explained what Hayes had ordered. And some of the soldiers objected, said they couldn't kill kids, said this was wrong, said it was a war crime. But Briggs pulled rank, said orders from battalion commander were absolute, said they'd all face court-martial if they refused. And he said if anyone reported this, he'd make sure they were charged with undermining command authority. Morrison was crying now, tears streaming down his face. So they did it. 7 soldiers lined up that family, the wife and 3 children, and executed them. The husband had already been killed during the initial entry when he'd allegedly reached for a weapon, but the wife and kids, they were murdered in cold blood on orders from battalion command. I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. I was there, witnessed the whole thing, stood in that house and watched American soldiers execute children because a lieutenant colonel had classified them as enemy combatants. And I didn't stop it, didn't physically intervene, just stood there frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. After it was done, Briggs radioed back to Hayes, reported insurgent cell neutralized, weapons cache secured. Hayes acknowledged and said good work, like they'd just completed a normal mission instead of committing mass murder. Then Briggs turned to his squad and to me, said what happened in that house, stayed in that house, said the official report would state that hostile forces were killed during the raid, said anyone who contradicted that story would face consequences, and everyone agreed, the 7 shooters, the other soldiers who'd witnessed it, me. We all agreed to cover up the murder of 3 children and their mother. Morrison stood and paced to the altar and back, unable to stay still. That night I tried to report it, went to Hayes directly, told him I'd witnessed the execution of civilians, and needed to report it through proper channels. And Hayes looked me in the eye and said, Chaplain Morrison, you witnessed the neutralization of an insurgent cell. If you file a report claiming otherwise, you'll be relieved of duty for mental health concerns, combat stress, inappropriate attachment to enemy civilians, and your report will be dismissed as the confused observations of someone who's not qualified to make tactical assessments. Then he said something that terrified me. He said, we have 7 soldiers willing to testify that only enemy combatants were killed. We have a weapons cache that proves hostile activity. Your word against theirs. Who do you think will be believed? So I had a choice. Report the war crime and be destroyed by false counter-accusations, or stay silent and be complicit in murder. What did you do? Morrison looked at me with devastated eyes. I tried to find a middle path. I went to the battalion psychiatrist, told him I was having moral distress over something I'd witnessed. The psychiatrist asked if I could be more specific. I started to explain about the executions, and he stopped me, said, Chaplain, I'm going to recommend you for immediate psychiatric evaluation. Combat stress, possible breakdown, you need treatment. I realized then that Hayes had already set the groundwork, had already positioned me as mentally unstable so that any report I made would be discredited. So I made a decision. I requested immediate return to the United States for personal crisis requiring urgent attention. And I left Iraq 3 days later. You abandoned us, abandoned the battalion, left us without a chaplain during the worst part of the deployment. I did, and I've hated myself for it ever since. But I couldn't stay, couldn't continue serving as a chaplain, providing spiritual guidance, preaching about morality and God's love while knowing I was complicit in the murder of children. I'd either have to speak the truth and be destroyed, or stay silent and continue enabling evil. So I ran. Morrison pulled out documents from a folder. These are the official records from that day. The after-action report states that a raid on a suspected insurgent safehouse resulted in 5 enemy KIA and the recovery of a significant weapons cache. Clean, professional, no mention of children, no mention of executions, just another successful operation. And this, he showed me his journal entry, is my account written the day after I witnessed it. Every detail, the orders from Hayes, the objections from some soldiers, the executions, the cover-up, everything. Why are you telling me this now, after 20 years? Morrison sat down and buried his face in his hands. Because I can't carry it anymore. Because I left the military and became a civilian pastor, and I've spent 20 years trying to minister to people while knowing I witnessed evil and did nothing to stop it. Because I'm a fraud who preaches about moral courage from a pulpit while I ran from the most important moral test of my life. And because 3 months ago, I saw an obituary. Staff Sergeant Briggs, dead at 51, suicide. Drove his car into a bridge abutment at high speed. And I realized he'd been carrying the same guilt I was, and I wondered if the other soldiers from that squad were carrying it too. And I knew I needed to finally tell someone before the truth died with all of us. What about Hayes, the lieutenant colonel who gave the order? Retired as a full colonel in 2015, lives in Virginia, successful post-military career as a defense contractor, never faced consequences for ordering the execution of civilians, never even acknowledged it happened. And the family? The victims? Do we know who they were? Morrison nodded. I researched them later. The father was Karim al-Hashimi. His wife was Aisha. Their children were Omar, age 9, Fatima, age 7, and Yasmin, age 4. They lived in that house in Baghdad. And they all died on July 28, 2004, classified as enemy combatants despite 3 of them being elementary school age. He showed me photographs he'd somehow obtained the family before the war. Smiling children. A normal family caught in a war zone. All dead because a weapons cache was found in their house. Have you tried to contact the other soldiers? The ones who were there? I've tracked some of them down. Of the 7 shooters, 2 are dead. Briggs by suicide, another in a car accident that may also have been suicide. 3 refused to respond to my attempts to contact them. 1 told me to let it fucking go and threatened me if I tried to bring it up again. The last one admitted he thinks about it every day but said he'd deny everything if I ever went public. So there's no one willing to corroborate your account. Exactly. It's my word against the official record, my journal against official after-action reports. The testimony of a chaplain who left mid-deployment for personal crisis against decorated soldiers and a respected colonel, who gets believed. I looked at the evidence Morrison had laid out, the journal entry, the official reports, the photographs of the family, the documented timeline of his departure from Iraq. What do you want from me? Why tell me specifically? Because you were there, because you served in that battalion, because you know the context of those operations, and because I need someone who was part of that deployment to hear my confession and help me decide what to do. Do I report it officially? Try to expose Hayes and the surviving soldiers? Risk being dismissed as mentally unstable or accused of making false allegations? Do I contact the family's relatives? Tell them how their loved ones really died? Give them the truth even though the truth can never bring justice? Or do I keep carrying it privately, document it for history, but not pursue active accountability? Let the guilty live their comfortable lives while I drown in guilt for witnessing their crime. I stood and walked around the sanctuary, trying to process this impossible situation. If you report this officially, it will destroy you. Hayes will paint you as mentally unstable. The soldiers will deny everything. You'll face accusations of making false allegations, possibly even legal consequences. And you have no physical evidence, no photos, no recordings, just your journal entry written after the fact. If you contact the family's relatives, you'll devastate them with knowledge that their loved ones were murdered by Americans and that the murderers were never punished. You'll reopen wounds that have been healing for 20 years. And if you stay silent, you'll continue to drown in the guilt that made you leave Iraq. Continue to be a pastor who can't practice what he preaches because he knows he failed the ultimate moral test. Morrison nodded. That's the impossible choice I've been facing for 20 years. Every option leads to suffering. I just can't decide whose suffering matters most. Mine, the victims' families, the perpetrators, or the abstract principle of truth and justice. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the confession hanging in the air of that small church sanctuary. Let me ask you something, I finally said. If you'd physically intervened that day, tried to stop the executions, what would have happened? I'd have been restrained by armed soldiers, possibly shot myself if they thought I was interfering with a combat operation, and the executions would have proceeded anyway. My intervention would have accomplished nothing except possibly adding myself to the body count, so you didn't have the power to stop it. No, but I had the power to report it afterward, to ensure it was documented and investigated, and I chose not to use that power because I was afraid of the consequences. You chose self-preservation over justice. That's the real moral failure you've been carrying. Morrison nodded. Yes, I witnessed a war crime, and instead of reporting it knowing it would destroy my career and credibility, I ran. I chose my own safety over honoring the deaths of that family, and I've been paying for that choice every day since. I thought about what I would have done in Morrison's position, whether I'd have had the courage to report knowing the system would crush me, whether I'd have sacrificed my career and reputation for the abstract principle of justice. I didn't know, and not knowing made it harder to judge Morrison. Here's what I think you should do, I said. Document everything completely. Every detail, every name, every piece of evidence you have. Seal it with instructions to be opened in 25 years, in 2049, when everyone directly involved will likely be dead. That way the truth is preserved for history. Researchers and investigators can examine it with the benefit of distance. The victims are properly memorialized instead of being forever classified as enemy KIA. But the living, the soldiers carrying guilt, the families trying to heal, aren't destroyed by immediate exposure. That's still hiding from it. No, it's acknowledging it while showing mercy to people who can't handle the truth right now. It's choosing to preserve truth without weaponizing it against the broken and the grieving. Morrison thought about this. And Hayes? He lives comfortably while knowing he ordered the execution of children. He faces no consequences while Briggs killed himself from guilt. That's just no. It's not just. But pursuing Hayes now, with your evidence and your credibility issues, won't result in justice. It will result in you being destroyed while Hayes hires lawyers and relies on official records to defend himself. Is that better than preserving the truth for when it can be properly examined? We talked through the night, discussing options, weighing consequences, trying to find the least terrible path forward. Finally, as dawn approached, Morrison made his decision. I'll document everything and seal it for 25 years, but I'm also going to write letters to the families. Not to explain what happened, that would be too cruel, but to acknowledge that their loved ones died in Baghdad in 2000, that they mattered, that they're remembered. I won't give details that would devastate them, but I'll let them know someone knows they existed as people, not just as statistics. And I'm going to contact the surviving soldiers privately, not to accuse or expose them, but to let them know I'm available if they ever need to talk about what happened. If the guilt is destroying them like it destroyed Briggs, I want them to know they're not alone. That's good. That's showing mercy while still acknowledging truth. Morrison looked at me with tears in his eyes. I failed as a chaplain that day in Baghdad, failed to protect the innocent, failed to stand up to evil, failed to report a war crime, and I've spent 20 years trying to rebuild a ministry on that foundation of failure. But maybe that failure is what makes me useful now. Maybe soldiers carrying guilt need a chaplain who understands failure instead of one who pretends to always have the answers. Maybe my broken faith is what allows me to help others with their broken faith. That's not redemption, I said. Don't make the mistake of thinking your suffering redeems the crime. I know, nothing redeems the murder of children. But maybe I can at least make my remaining years count for something, can be present for people carrying impossible guilt, can witness their suffering the way I failed to properly witness that family's deaths. Morrison walked me to my car as the sun rose over the small Pennsylvania church. Before I left, he gave me copies of everything. His journal, his documentation, his plan for preserving the truth. Thank you for listening, for not judging me more harshly than I judge myself, for helping me find a path that preserves truth while showing mercy. I didn't do this for you, I said honestly. I did it because those children deserve to be remembered accurately eventually, and because Briggs deserved to not die alone with his guilt. But you abandoned us in Iraq. That part I can't forget. I understand, and I don't expect forgiveness, just wanted you to know why. Wanted someone from the battalion to understand that I didn't leave because I was weak or afraid of combat. I left because I witnessed something that destroyed my ability to serve both God and the military. I drove away thinking about Morrison's impossible choice, about the family that died, about Briggs's suicide, about Hayes living comfortably, about the other soldiers carrying secret guilt. And I thought about what I would have done in Morrison's position, whether I'd have had the courage to report knowing I'd be destroyed, whether sacrificing myself would have accomplished anything except adding another casualty to the list. I still don't know the answer. Morrison died last year, heart attack at 67. At his funeral, several people spoke about his ministry, about how he'd helped veterans process trauma, about his special gift for counseling people carrying guilt and moral injury. No one mentioned Baghdad. No one knew why he'd left Iraq mid-deployment. No one understood that his entire post-military ministry had been built on trying to atone for one terrible day when he'd witnessed evil and done nothing. His documentation is sealed, to be opened in 2049. The truth will eventually be known. Kareem, Aisha, Omar, Fatima, and Yasmin will be properly memorialized. Hayes will be exposed posthumously. The soldiers will be understood as people carrying impossible guilt, but that's for future historians to wrestle with. For now, all we have is Morrison's broken ministry, Briggs's suicide, Hayes's comfortable retirement, and the knowledge that sometimes witnessing evil and doing nothing destroys you just as surely as committing evil yourself. Morrison spent 20 years in spiritual crisis because he prioritized his own safety over reporting a war crime, but he also spent 20 years helping others process their guilt and trauma, helping veterans find meaning despite moral injury, being present for people broken by war in ways he understood intimately. That's not redemption, but it's something. Maybe it's the best we can hope for when faced with impossible moral choices. Acknowledge the failure, carry the weight, and try to make the remaining years count for something. The truth is preserved now, painful, incomplete, waiting to be revealed. And Morrison is dead, having finally confessed but never quite forgiven himself. That's all we get sometimes. Confession without redemption, truth without justice, understanding without peace. It's not enough, but it's honest. And Morrison was right about one thing. His broken faith made him useful to other people with broken faith. Sometimes our failures are what qualify us to help others with their failures, even if we never quite overcome our own.